any pagan tradition is going to have a priesthood. So once they start to become part of the church, these notions of clergy laity are going to just follow right along with it. And so pre-Augustine, a lot of the early church fathers adopted these distinctions. And let's read about a couple, just for instance. One is the 2nd century, long before Augustine, Ignatius of Antioch, in a writing to the Ephesians, he wrote a letter to the Ephesians, 200 years after Paul did. He says this: "It is manifest that we should look upon the bishop, even as we would look upon the Lord himself, standing as he does before the Lord." Again, this person, this clergy person that distinguishes between, or is in between, I guess, Jesus and everyone else. Now, what's interesting about Ignatius's praising of the bishop, this praising of the bishop or this clergy person to the congregation in Ephesus is interesting. And let's go to Revelation chapter 2. Because in Revelation chapter 2, the book of Revelation begins with the disclosure, Jesus' disclosure or messages to these congregations, 7 of them in Asia Minor. And one of them is in Ephesus. In fact, many of your Bibles, the heading of chapter 2 is the message to Ephesus. Okay, so check out verse 6. This is Jesus commends the believers in Ephesus by saying this: "Yet this you do have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate." You hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Question: what on earth are the Nicolaitans? And answer: ain't no one knows. This is a highly debated topic, even today. Who are these folks? And no one agrees. But here's what the word means. The etymology of the word in Greek derives from 2 words. Nike, and some of you may be wearing Nikes. Conquest. Conquest of the Laos, the laity. Jesus hated the conquerors of the laity. If that's what, well, that's what the word does mean. But if that's what the heresy was, an early attempt to distinguish in this manner, that's what the word means, conquerors of the laity. Nike, Laos. Then we may have, even in Revelation, an early manifestation of this concept. After Ignatius, Clement of Rome writes a letter, 1 Clement, in chapter 40, verse 5. He teaches about this distinction that needs to be preserved in congregations between clergy and laity. And so there are early evidences of this starting to come into and start to become part of this apparatus of a counterfeit election and a counterfeit kingdom. It wasn't until the 3rd century that clergy was employed regularly to designate a limited number of persons who functioned in Christian assemblies. One of the worst outcomes of this doctrine of clergy was that it communicated the notion that without clergy present, there is no church. Baptism, Lord's Supper, many other church practices could not happen without clergymen. It became early on that only the professionals could do this. It's just so far, this counterfeit clergy, from the command that we've been given by the Master. Let's go back to Tillich with regard to counterfeit clergy and its history of Christian thought. In the struggle against pagans, Jews, and heretics, the bishop, so this is like the king of the clergy, the bishop became more and more important. This is the guy, the king of the local assembly, became more and more important. The bishops were representatives of true doctrine, and gradually the bishop became a monarch among the elders and deacons, giving rise to the monarchical episcopate. Another good book is called In the Shadow of the Sword, The Birth of Islam and the Rise of the Global Arab Empire. It's by Tom Holland, this guy in England who's being threatened with his life, just like Salman Rushdie. Let me read you a couple quotes as it relates to counterfeit kingdom. The records of each individual church had duly been entrusted to an official chosen by the local congregation to serve as an overseer. The overseer, or in Greek the episkopos, is sometimes translated as bishop. Soon enough, however, these same bureaucrats began soaringly to outgrow their origins as mere functionaries. 3 centuries on, it had become the entitlement of a bishop to rule almost as a monarch over the congregation that selected him. He, it was, who would act as spokesman for local Christians in their dealings with the broader church, moved to resolve their problems and defended them in times of crisis, defined for them their beliefs and prescribed for them the texts that they should read and answer for before God. So here you got in this book on Islam, you got some great scholarship, again identifying counterfeit clergy. Later in this book, there's another good quote. Not everyone who laid claim to the name of Christian was necessarily willing to sell themselves to the authority of a bishop. The text quotes, "Beware false prophets," unquote. Christ himself had warned, "Who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves." Food for thought. For how can we tell sheep from wolf disguised as sheep? This is Tom Holland's book. So that leads to Cyprian. Briefly on Cyprian. Cyprian is actually the main church father that really digs deep into counterfeit clergy and sets it as a solid foundation even before Augustine comes into play. Cyprian became a bishop in 249 of his congregation and was pre-Jerome, pre-Augustine. Here are some quotes from Cyprian with regard to counterfeit clergy. "He who does not have the church as mother cannot have God as father." Another one, "There is no salvation outside the church." Again, counterfeit kingdom. Creating a kingdom. "He, the bishop, imitates Christ. He offers a true and perfect sacrifice to God the Father within the church." That's Cyprian. Another Cyprian quote, "There is one person for the time priest in the church, and for the time judge in the stead of Christ, whom, if according to divine teaching, the whole fraternity should obey. No one would stir up anything against the college of priests." And the final quote of Cyprian, "The bishop is in the church, and the church is in the bishop. If anyone is not with the bishop, he is not with the church." So, counterfeit clergy, building on counterfeit kingdom and counterfeit election. Post-Cyprian, again Augustine, and even to now, this concept really continues unabated in the church. Paul Tillich again, "The church is the institution in which salvation is attained. This represents a change from the early Christian period, in which the church was simply a community of saints and not an institution for salvation." Tillich goes on, "The bishop is sacerdos, a Latin word for priest. The main function of the priest is sacrificial. The priest sacrifices the elements of the Lord's Supper and thus repeats the sacrifice of Golgotha." So very early on, you had counterfeit clergy.